All right, no need to worry about that. My name is Paul Womack. I go by Willie Green. That's my producer name. I live and work here in Brooklyn, New York. This is my studio, the Greenhouse Recording Company. Um, and I'm happy to be here with y'all today, zooming in, and we're going to talk about hip-hop mixing. We're going to talk about hip-hop production. Any questions that you have, I want it to be a conversation. So if you have any questions for me, you don't have to wait till the end or anything. You can put them in the chat or you can just chime in. But I want to talk about what I do, and I want to talk about what y'all are doing and how we can help make your records even better. I brought some music with me today. It's a record from an album of mine I put out a couple years ago. The album is called Doc Savage. It's a hip hop album. I produced it. I don't rap. I'm a terrible rapper, but I reached out to a lot of great MCs that I know to come in and rap on my beats on this project. It's kind of a sci-fi hip hop kind of thing. It's very kind of experimental, kind of spacey. I like weird sounds, I like out of space. So that's what this project is about. And today we're looking at one song from that called The Lost Oasis. It's a record with three MCs who I work with. A guy named Henry Canyons, his MC, her name is Liquid, and then also a guy named Def C. They're from all over the United States. Henry is from LA. Liquid is here in Harlem, uptown, and then Def C is actually in Chicago. So very similar to what we're doing now, just reaching out to people everywhere. And, the internet makes the world a little bit smaller, and people can come together and connect just like we're doing right now. All right, so I'm going to hold up right there for a second. Usually what I do, the reason I play so much of that song, you kind of like, Green, you play me the whole song, I can find on Spotify or whatever, but when I sit down to mix a record, whether I produced it or somebody else produced it, like if you all send me some tracks to mix something, the first thing you got to do is you got to listen to the song. I see a lot of people, they get the files in, and then all of a sudden they're turning knobs and they're adding in plugins. But the main key to mixing a song is you're mixing the song. You're not mixing the files. You're not mixing the snare sound. You're mixing the entire song, and you got to have an idea of what's coming, what the song is about, what the content is, because the first key to record production is everything has to serve the song, right? If it's not adding to the song, it's not supposed to be in there, right? When you think about how a listener, how your audience is going to hear what you do, they don't understand, they don't care about snare compression, they don't care about reverb tails, they don't know what those things are. We do, we're audio professionals, we are the ones who care about that. They just want to know that the song feels good, right? That's the biggest key, is that the song has to feel good. That's what's going to make them play it again, okay? So anytime I sit down, when I get files in the mix from somebody, I make sure they send me a rough mix of what they've been working on and where they hear it, and that's where I begin so I can understand what the song is supposed to be. Every move I make has to serve that main thing. So that's where I begin. So that's where we're starting today. I am going to share my screen again because we don't need to stare right at my face all day, but I want you to see I'm a Cubase user. A lot of people, there's so many different softwares out now that the main thing about your software is just whatever's comfortable for you. Whatever you can work quickly in, whether that's Ableton or that's Pro Tools or Logic or Cubase or FL Studio, whatever it is, all the tools are good now. So it just comes down to what lets you as a creator be able to move quickly and be able to move fast. Let me ask you all, what software do you like working in? Are you guys working in Ableton? Like what are you into?
Well, for me, I work with Pro Tools and Logic Pro.
Okay, so you work with both. What makes you pick one over the other?
Generally, I use Pro Tools only for mixing, but if I plan to produce, I use Logic Pro.
Right, yeah. Pro Tools is great for mixing. It's great for recording. I haven't always. The reason I'm on Cubase is because I find that is a little easier for me for production and mixing and everything in between. So I do everything together. I made this beat. Let's talk about the production of it a little bit, and then we'll start to look into the mix side. So I made this beat originally in Cubase. It's big sounds, but it's not actually a lot of sounds in the beat, right? So it's really just, if you look here, kick, snare, hi-hat, and then an 808, and then I've got this percussion loop. I like a lot of loops. I like hand drums. I like congas. I like shakers and stuff. I grew up playing drums and playing percussion, so all that stuff is very much in me. So a lot of my music has a lot of those percussion loops. That's what gives it the energy. That's what gives it the feel to me, the motion. And then I have, what I'm using is samples. I play the vocal samples that are in here actually came from this keyboard pack where you can, it's a sample pack where you can just play back these different vocal samples from people around the world. So I just took this cool sounding one and I let that be my guide for it, and then just built everything around it. And I almost had almost an apocalyptic type feel, and so when I sent this beat to the MCs, they wrote in that direction. So the whole thing is kind of a story about the resources of the world, but how it's really about humans. It's about, water and energy and love and connection and all of that together, and those being the critical resources that we need in life. So that's the concept of the song. So I made sure that everything in the song as I'm mixing it is serving that concept, right? So there's distorted delays and reverbs and stuff. I like anything I can put some distortion on and kind of grunge it up a little bit. I'm really into that. So we got all that kind of sound in there. And we got a little bit of strings. We got some other voice samples and a little guitar type, vocal type thing here at the end. But let's jump in, I think, with the drums. Let's look at these drums for a bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and solo that drum folder. Alright, so that's the basic drum loop. It loops out throughout the song, but that's the general, that's what it is for the drums. I'll mute the loop for a second, and so this is just my straight ahead drum pattern. This is basically a lot of things I do. When I create, I generally start with the sample or whatever the main keyboard part is, if there is a sample on the record. Like this one, I started with that voice and then built things around it. But being a drummer, that's the next thing that I do. Whatever your musical perspective is, that's a good place to start because that's where you're comfortable and you can build everything around it, right? So here's the drum loop. Right, so pretty straightforward stuff there. Kick, snare, hats. On the hats, I've got a little bit of delay on them, setting it to an eighth note to delay, so the hats are playing, but then they're adding more space around it, so it's more movement. Everything with me is about the feel of the groove, right, and about things moving together and getting that kind of sway in. Especially on this record, I want that sway. We're going to come back. I want to talk about that 808 specifically because I'm doing some things on there that could really help your 808s pop out, but I want to come back to that low end in a minute, so stay tuned with me. And then this is the loop. Alright, so that's my loop, and I want to show you what I'm doing with it. You see here, these are my high and low pass filters that I have. They're built into Cubase, but you could use any plugin for this. And I'm taking out, filtering off everything below about 200 hertz. A lot of times you think, well, you don't want to take the bottom out of your drums, you don't want to take the low end out of your drums grain, that's where it hits. But low end, there's a limited amount of low end you can have in a song, right? You've only got so much headroom in your mix, you only got so much that you can have in your mix volume-wise, you got to make space for things, right? So with this loop, the main idea behind the loop is I want the cymbals, I want the attack of the percussion, but I've already got a big kick drum and this big 808 in there, so I don't want those things competing with themselves. If the bottom end of the loop is not what I'm looking for, ideally, then I'm gonna filter that out to leave space for the bottom end that I do want, right? There's only so much space down there, and I don't want something taking away that room from my 808s. So that's why you see right here this large this big roll off on the low end. Can everybody see my screen? I want to make sure I'm sharing the screen right. And then you'll also see using this fab filter, and that's just a couple notches just in the middle. Again, certain frequencies that might be peaking out a little too much, I want to make sure that those are reined in. So I'm going to play again. Sorry, I'm not seeing the chat window. Okay, good. All right, I'm seeing your chats. I'm going to jump back and forth between the chat so I can see you and then my screen. Glad you can see me. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of people are working in Ableton. I like Ableton a lot. I like Ableton a lot for creating. The way that you can create with it, I find, is just so different and so fast compared to a lot of other ways. It's kind of a new way of thinking about music production. I find that really exciting. I really like that. It's different for me from mixing, and so I still like to mix in Cubase, which the mixer in it I think is a little closer to a traditional mixer. But I've been on Cubase for 20 years, and so I'm fast on it. I know I'm going to get that mix out fast and accurate and ready to go. So that's a big part of that. But when I need to change a pace, when I need a different perspective on something, where I go to Ableton as well. That's a real good one. I'm going to jump back down here to my screen. I got to figure out how to get the chat on my screen when I'm sharing. I'll figure that out in a sec. All right, so if you heard that difference there on that percussion loop, it's very subtle. I'm not notching out a whole bunch, around 250 and then around 550, 545, 550. Those frequencies right there are spots that really, those are kind of what I call them the mud zones, right? That's where certain frequencies start to build up and things feel a little bit muddy. But those are also places in a vocal that you might want, right? 250 to 300 especially, that's where things start to really kind of build up. But in a vocal, that's where a lot of like the weight of your voice is going to be, you know? And the last thing you don't want a real thin sounding MC. That's not hip hop to me. I want, if you're rapping, male, female, whoever, it doesn't matter. You got to have a lot of weight to your voice, because your voice, the rap voice, is so important. People talk about singers' voices, but rappers' voices are so critical to what they do, right? If you hear Jay Electronica rap, but his voice is all thin, it doesn't carry the same weight. He's got that heavy tone. So instead of boosting that in the vocals, what I'm doing is I'm making room for it in other sounds. So you'll see, and probably, let's look, what am I doing in the vocal sample? Same thing. Right here, this is the EQ for the vocal sample, and I'm taking out in the same places, right? Because the most important thing in your song, if you're making a vocal record, if your record has a vocal in it, that vocal is the most important thing in your song. That's the part that people sing along to, they rap along with. That's what your average person understands and can really connect to. The instruments are important too, but that vocal is the key. So I don't want to compromise my vocal. I would rather notch out something from somewhere else and make space for that vocal to be big and have all the space that it needs. So I'm going to play here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bypass this EQ on the voice, and we're going to see how that affects the vocals. Here it comes. All right, so you hear that difference? To me, that's a huge difference. When that vocal is EQ, when the vocal pad, the sample is EQ'd, Henry's voice, that's Henry Cannon's in this first verse, his voice sits right here in the middle, it's right present, you hear every word, there's no question. When you take out that EQ on the vocal sample, all of a sudden you hear some of his words, but when the sample comes in and he's pushed to the back or whatever it's going to be, your vocalist can never be pushed to the back because, again, they're the most important thing. They're the star of the song. They've always got to be out front. So that's how, and I'll do that, you know, pretty early on in the mix. I'll start to get my vocal sound, and then it's like, okay, let's start making some space for it. Let's start making some room. Let's start making some room for the vocal to sit right. We'll look at a couple other ideas on. You know what? Let's just jump into the vocal right now. The vocal is the most important thing. Let's look at it. I'm going to jump forward. I want to give all the MCs some shine. So let's look at verse 2. Let's look at Liquid and see what she's doing here. I'm going to play a couple bars and then we'll look at it. All right. So you get the idea. Let's talk about vocal treatments. That's the term I use for how you treat the vocal, right? Simple, straightforward. The main thing with me for the vocal is that, again, it needs to be right up front. It needs to be there. It needs to be really clear, but you don't want it to feel separated from the rest of the record, right? If your vocal is just sitting on top of the beat, then the beat, by comparison, is going to feel weak, right? Does that make sense? With me, my whole mixing concept is this. Everything is about contrast. If nothing feels loud in the mix, if everything in the mix is super loud and screaming at you, right? Nothing in the mix is going to feel bright and open and clear if everything in your mix is super bright. So you want to have some things, okay, if I want this vocal to feel very bright, I want to have something in there that's not as bright, so it's obvious to the listener, okay, this is the bright thing and this is the not bright thing, or this is the loud thing, this is the quiet thing. So it's all about that balance and that dance, that back and forth, but you don't want things to feel separated, because then instead of you having a song, it's beats and rhymes, and that's cool, but when you put it together, it gives you a different experience. So what are we doing on Liquid's voice here? I'm going to jump back to my screen share. And let's take a look here on the side. So I'm starting off. This is a special move that I do. I came up with this myself. This is a cool one, I think. Make sure to steal this one. What I want is a nice consistent level on the vocal. And a lot of people use this plugin here from Waves. It's the Vocal Rider, and they'll put it on the end of their vocal chain to make sure that that vocal stays consistent the whole way through. And that's cool, but I use it a little bit different. What I do with it is I put it at the beginning of my vocal chain. Excuse me. And I'm doing that so I get a nice, even, consistent level going into my compressors, and so my compressor is doing a little bit more of just kind of shaping the sound than trying to control they're trying to control the dynamics as much. I know that's what a compressor does, but this lets the compressor not work so hard, because this is essentially acting as a compressor. Because what does a compressor do, right? It reduces the level of a sound when it hits a certain threshold. Well, that's the same thing that the vocal rider is doing. It's adjusting the level to stay in a certain spot. So it is a dynamics processor. So I'm basically starting with some dynamics just to smooth that vocal out.
Cup runneth over, tearing through the terrain, a tug of war with the heart and the brain. We climb mountains to escape boulders. Only the tongue kiss the lava molten. The days are long, but the years are shorter.
Right. So it's not doing a lot. I prefer to use my compressors and my dynamic stuff in series, so I'll have a few doing a little bit of gain reduction rather than one compressor squashing the hell out of everything on its own. I find that when you break up the job a little bit between a couple of compressors, it might sound more natural sometimes. I don't want this to sound like she's super heavy compressed. I use a lot of compressors, but that's just not my style as much. So I'm starting with the vocal rider, so that's going to give me an even vocal sound. And then I have a de-esser pretty early in my vocal chain. Sometimes I have it later. I will say that there's no one way to do this. This is how I do it on this song. But different things change, and so I'm going to tell you my ideas of why I'm doing things, but then take those ideas and apply them the way that you want to, because that's what's going to make y'all's records sound like you. So I've got this de-esser coming in next, and that's because I don't want the de-esser hitting my compressor later on. I don't want the sibilance to hit that and trigger that in a funny way that I might not want. This final compressor, I want that just shaping the sound. I don't want any wild stuff getting in there and triggering it funny. So my de-esser is next. And then a little bit of EQ. Nothing too crazy. Again, I don't want the build up here, around here. That's 250 again. That's the trouble spot. That's the mud zone. So I'm trying to keep that clear. And even though I left space for that in the samples, I still wanted a little bit more control over that. And then again, up at 500 hertz, because that's the next octave up from the mud zone, right? Every doubling in frequency is an octave if you think of the keyboard. So that's one thing to remember. If you got a problem here, your next octave up, your harmonics might still be something. And then I'm taking off the trouble spots with the de-esser, but I don't want it to make her sound dull, so I just open it back up a little bit up top. And then here we've got a compressor, an Atelier compressor. Let's see. What's that? Somebody got a question? Let me know if you do. Sorry, I'm not hearing you now. But yeah, if y'all got questions, definitely jump in, hop in, and let me know. Because I'll just keep talking. Yeah, we got this Atelier compressor. Sorry, I don't know if you have a question. If you don't have a question, just do me a favor and just mute that mic real fast. Sorry, I can't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen, so I'm just checking back in. Let's see what this compressor is doing here.
Cup runneth over, tearing through the terrain, a tug of war with the heart and the brain. We climb mountains to escape boulders. Only the tongue kiss the lava.
Right, so if you see how much on this gain reduction meter, I'm not taking off a ton. You know, and honestly, probably I'm taking off at the most maybe 4.5 dB in gain reduction. And my ratio is not super high. It's like 2.5, something like that. Again, with these compressors, I don't want it to super crazy squeeze the sound. I just want it to control her, right? And just kind of keep her right in that spot. But what if I'm doing all that and I'm not getting enough volume and enough presence out of the vocal? I'm also doing a parallel compressor, which is on this send. That's the Vox comp. That's a vocal compressor. And let me open that up and show you. That's where I'm doing the much more aggressive compression. So I got this thing here. It's called the Pawn Shop Comp. It's a very aggressive, heavy compressor. That's where I'm doing that kind of thing. Got you. Thank you. Thank you. I will definitely mute the Zoom. So let me show you here what the Pawn Shop compressor is doing. Right. So that's what that's doing. That it's not making the vocal louder necessarily. Like when the vocal's feeling it's in the same place, it's just pushing it forward a little bit. It's not the same as just I'm going to turn the fader up and now she's yelling over everything. But that parallel compressor adds some weight behind her, so she really has a full sound and it's just sitting right there. And that's where you see I have, it's a fast attack, pretty fast release, and that meter, it's really hitting. It's pumping like that, right? That's okay because this is just being blended in behind that nice consistent vocal that we got. So that pumping is going to give her some energy, but it's not going to sound like it. It's just going to feel like it. Remember, everything in a mix is about getting a feel. That's what makes people hype. They don't care about my compression ratios. They just want to know that it's hype and that it's moving. So that's what the parallel is doing. Also use that a lot on drums to get some pumping and excitement with drums without them not feeling overly loud. So all of my vocals are going to have that on Henry, Liquid, Def C. They're all sending there. And I'm sending, when this is blue to send here, that means I'm sending it pre-fader. So no matter what vocal rides I do with the main vocal track, it's not changing the amount of parallel compression I have, and then I can adjust that separately. Any questions on the compression stuff, on the vocal stuff? If not, I'm going to move on to some other parts of that vocal. Let's look at Def C, and I want to talk about this delay that I'm using. I want to talk about reverbs and delays, and rap music and just in general. A lot of hip-hop artists, modern hip-hop doesn't have a lot of reverb and stuff on the vocals. A lot of stuff is pretty dry. And that's just kind of the way that's what's in style right now, right? So, I'm reading this question here. Oh yeah, Manly's nice. Okay, yeah, great question. Let's talk about this question from Al in the chat about recording with compression. I'm a big fan of making things sound right as early in the process as possible. You feel what I'm saying? The better something sounds when you record it, the easier your mix is going to be down the line because you don't have to do as much in the mix. So if you're comfortable with your compression and you're confident that what you're doing is going to sound good, yeah, record that on the way in. Record that in your preamp. Why not? Record making is all about making decisions. That's really the nuts and bolts of it. That's the most important thing. So if you got the right decision early on, make that decision then. What I do, I usually record with compression, but it'll be pretty safe compression. I might take off just a couple dB just to kind of keep it under control, just to kind of sculpt the sound. I'm probably not going to be smashing something and reducing it by 10 dB a gain reduction. That's something you can't undo, right? You can't uncompress something later on if you smash it like that. Even using an expander or something like that, it doesn't work to bring back those original dynamics. So if you're not real comfortable with compression, because compression is kind of the hardest effect to hear or really understand. If you put a delay on something, you hear an echo that rings out and you know what that is. But when you're dealing with compression, it's harder to hear And so you might, if you're not super comfy with it, record it clean, and then, you can experiment with it later on. If you are comfy with it, go ahead and get that. No reason to wait to make that decision if you know that's what you want to do. Obviously, and that goes for any effects recording in, whether it's EQ, distortion, whatever you want to do. It depends on how risky you feel. If you're a gambler, go ahead and get that on the way in. If you're feeling, a little more conservative, then you can save that compression for later on. So I'm going to jump over here. Let's talk about that reverb and about that delay. I don't put reverb really on a lot of rap vocals unless it's a very specific effect I'm looking for. But what I do instead to create some space, a completely dry vocal it doesn't sound natural. Everywhere in the world, everywhere you go, any room that you're in, there's some kind of room sound. There's some kind of ambience around there. So when you just have a completely bone dry vocal, it doesn't feel natural to me. So I like to put a little bit of space on something. I'm going to solo this Def C verse, and I'm going to show you what I'm doing with this slap delay. All right, so that's obviously, especially just soloed, that's a big difference. You hear that on the sides, it's kind of some brightness. And when I say a slap delay, I'll open this up. What I'm talking about, I'm using this Echo Boy Jr. And a slap delay is just a very short delay time, so it sounds exactly like what it sounds like. It slaps back at you. And what this is doing, there's not any feedback on there. I'm rolling off a little bit of the top end, so the feedback is short. And what that's going to let me do is it implies a sense of space. Like, oh, he's obviously in some kind of space. I hear something bouncing around, but it's not taking up as much sonic real estate as a long reverb that shows that he's in a thing. You don't need to do all of that. I just want to give people the impression that he's in some kind of space. And what it's also doing is it's widening the vocal. So he's sitting here, but now he feels like it's a much wider space. And when it's soloed, it feels like a lot, and you're really hearing that. But when the entire track is in with everything going on, the track kind of eats up some of that delay, and it's just enough of a hint that he's in a space that it lets the listener understand, okay, this is not some weird super dry vocal that's detached from the track. So I'm going to play that again. I'll go in and out with the delay, and then I'll bring the track back in so you can hear how that's working. All right, so you see how that works there? So when the whole track is in and there's all kinds of stuff moving around, there's samples, there's the big 808, which I promise I'm going to come back to, and I'm not going to forget you. So it's eating up a lot of that delay. But when I muted that at the end, all of a sudden that's his Def C hanging out here in the center all by himself, and he doesn't feel attached to the track. So a little bit of that delay just kind of glues him right in, right? And if you look, this is the slap track. I'm not mixing a lot of it into the record. I'm sending, where's this track? I'm sending a healthy amount to it. I like to, every piece of gear has the level that whoever made it, they want to see a certain amount of healthy input. You want to feed good level signal into your plugins, so the resolution of the plugins can be at its best. And I just blend in a little bit as much as I need. So sometimes the faders might seem low, but I'm sending a lot into that effect. But that slap delay, that's the glue that kind of spreads the vocals out and glues them back into the track to make it feel like they're not just hanging out. And there's a space, but there's not the long reverb trail. He's not going to the same reverb hall that like the big vocals are. Let's get in these 808s because I keep promising, and I'm going to show you what's going on here. How are we feeling about vocals? Anybody have any vocal specific questions? We'll come back to it, I'm sure. But if you have questions about vocals, just let me know. But let's look at these 808s here. All right, pretty straightforward. It hits, boom, whatever. But I'm doing some stuff to it here. What am I doing? Obviously, they sound a little distorted, right? That is on purpose. Like I told you, anytime I can distort something, I can grime it up a little bit, you know I'm going to do it. But that's not just for fun. It's partly for fun, because I like distortion, but there's a real reason for that, right? I'm going to take this distortion off, and I'm going to play the 808 now. Right, so the drum was already, there was a little bit of fuzz on top. I'm sure I picked it for that reason. But when I added in the distortion, this harmonics from Soft Tube, I'm driving it right here a good amount, and I'm pushing the input up a good amount. The reason I'm distorting it, and the reason I distort low-end instruments in particular, is I'm lucky. I've got a nice studio. I've got big speakers, and I got a subwoofer in here because, you know, that bottom is very important to me. That's near and dear to my heart, right? But everybody, most people are not listening on this kind of setup. Most people are listening on earbuds. That's where music is played, either on earbuds or out of somebody's phone speaker or somewhere where they may not be able to get all that low end that I'm hearing in here with my with my subwoofer, right? So just saw the question about vocals. I'll get back to that in 1 second. Don't let me forget you. Most people don't have a subwoofer attached to their thing, you know? So how do we make sure that if you're listening on some earbuds that the low end is really ringing through? Well, that's where a little bit of saturation, a little bit of distortion is going to help you out, right? What happens is, let's say you have a sine wave. You have like a sine wave type bass line, and it's rattling the speakers, it's rattling your trunk, home, everybody's real hyped about it, and then you put it on in your phone and there's no low end. That's because that low sine wave is not going to, this speaker here, this headphone, this earbud, can't reproduce that low frequency. So what I do is I start distorting it, throwing on some saturation, and that adds harmonics above that initial frequency. So you have your sine wave, and then that distortion adds higher frequency harmonics to it. When you add those frequencies, now we're getting into something that your earbuds can actually reproduce. So when you add those higher frequencies, that's going to trick people's ear into knowing where that where the bottom note, where that sine wave, where that fundamental actually is. So it's a psychoacoustics type thing, but it's giving people's ears an idea of where they should be looking for that bass, so now the bass is feeling like it's there for them. So I'm adding the saturation on these 808s, so you can play that on any speaker, and that thing is still going to hit. It's still going to ring through because your ear can grab onto something. On this particular song, because it's a heavy song that's distorted, I'm pushing it pretty far, and it's very clear that it has that saturation on it. I could go a little bit less, you know, and what I do is I listen on a small speaker, on an iPod speaker, or maybe on earbuds, and I put in just enough so I can hear where that low end is starting to come through, and I'll work with it from there, because I may not want a distorted bass in my song, but I do need something for that to be able to peek through on lower on a lower on a smaller speaker, shall we say, right? So that's step one of what I'm doing, and then I got, you know, after that, some compression on it. Let's see what that compression is doing. All right, so compression-wise, it's pretty straightforward. I got a slow attack on it because on this one, the way this beat is hitting, I want the very front of that transient to ring through, and then fast release just to let that tail off so you get the sustain of it, right? I got a question in the chat. Let me hop over to the chat. Let me get this chat window open. Great question about adding the frequencies. Yeah, it depends on the distortion that you use, right? If you use a really heavy, aggressive distortion, here, let me show you an example. Go back to the screen. Can I just... There we go. I popped the chat window out. There we go. No, I don't need to go back and forth. Let's say, I'm going to mute this. I'm just going to open up a different distortion. It's one of my favorites, Decapitator. Sound Toys makes really cool stuff, so we'll use that. There's a lot of different parameters, a lot of different things you can tweak, and honestly, you know, all distortion is not created equal. This thing has this thing called a punish button. I'm going to show you, right? That alone, just in 3 clicks, that's a wide range of different distortion flavors, right? And all those are not going to fit. When I hit that high, that punish button, that's giving me now a lot more high-end distortion, which in this case is not what I want, because that is going to disturb the other instruments. That's going to start getting up into where I have my vocals and my vocal samples. If I had a much more open beat that was maybe drums, a synth line or two, and then the 808 is a big primary part of the beat, then yeah, I might let it use a little more of that high distortion because that's a bigger focus on it. In this song, we're getting that hit, but the 808 is not the key. So really, the frequencies really do, it really depends on the song, and then the amount that you distort also affects how much of those higher frequencies that you get. So, you know, you just got to really blend it to taste and make sure that it's fitting. Again, everything comes back to the song. As long as it's hitting for the song, then it's going to be right. Whatever makes the song better is what's right. The LA2A is a great compressor for that. It's a big, warm-sounding compressor, and it lets the low end, and it really holds the low end. I love the LA2A for that. This TLA 100 that I have on here is a very similar kind of compressor. It's a tube optical compressor, just like the LA2A, and it's doing a very similar thing. So, Al, you're right on with that. XJ, does that answer your question about the frequencies? Let me know if it doesn't. I could look into that some more. I hate to be like, it's just whatever the song needs, but a lot of times that is the reason why you would do something, because that is what the song needs. So that's what I'm doing with my 808s. On this song, I'm not doing a lot. A little bit of EQ on them. Here, I'm actually bringing up that 300 hertz. I wanted something to fill that spot a little bit, and then I'm rolling off the top because it had that fuzz on it to begin with. And just like we're saying, XJ, I don't want the high end of the distortion of that fuzz to interact with other things. So I'm just rolling that off, you know, just taking that down to make sure it sounds good. While we're here, let's also just take a look at the kick and 808 relationship. Let's see if there's anything interesting there. So another reason, cool, thank you, XJ. This 808 isn't necessarily your typical 808 where it also has all of that super bottom. It does the job that it needs to do, but you got to make a choice in your mix. This mix actually doesn't have a bass line in particular, so this may not apply right here. But again, when we talk about, there's only so much space, there's only so much real estate for low frequencies, because low frequency waves are very big. They're a lot bigger than your high frequencies, and there's only so much room before they start clashing. So with your different low-end instruments, and that's your kick drums, that's your 808s, that's any bass lines that you might have, you need to make sure that they are indeed working together, right? Like they're not separate entities. So my kick, I knew this kick, I want that to be heavy and really thump. So the 808 I chose sits a little bit on top of that. They're not necessarily working in the same exact frequency range, but they're complementary, right? I know we've got some people who work in Ableton here. I don't know how many of you all are beat makers versus, you know, people who are recording instruments or whatever. But when you're making a beat, it's similar to making a kick drum on a drum set. You might have a mic inside for one part of the sound, and you got a different mic outside for a different part of the sound, and you're blending them together for that exactly right kick drum sound. Well, that's the same thing as using samples that you get from Ableton or maybe Splice or whatever. It's the same concept. I might take a kick that has a lot of nice attack, but maybe doesn't have a lot of bottom, but then I'll layer that something that has a big thump but doesn't have that same attack to it, and I'll put them together and I'll make sure that they're working together, and that's how you can get a real huge kick. So when I'm looking at this 808, that hits every time on the downbeat with the kick drum, right? So these things have to work together every time they hit. If not, they're gonna, the bottom is not gonna hit properly. So I'm choosing sounds, I'm EQing the sounds, not just individually, but with the bigger picture in mind, right? I'm soloing things to show you examples, but I don't solo a lot when I'm mixing. I'll solo a track to kind of get an idea of how it sounds and if I need to fix something. But when I'm working on my kick drum sound, I'm probably going to have my 808 also playing. I'll have some other things. I'll have that drum loop also playing, because all of these things have to work together. And no one's ever just going to hear, my bad, no one's ever just going to hear the 808 only by itself. Like, I'm not going to release the 808 track. When the song comes out, they hear the whole song together, and so it doesn't matter how the 808 sounds like itself. It sounds by itself. It only matters how it sounds in this experience. So that's some of my low-end ideas. Let me see what I want to get into next. Any specific things, I'm just going to keep on talking. Any specific things that you want me to take a look at, just let me know in the chat, and we can get into that some more. Staying on that low-end thing for a second, let's look at these filters. I'm doing a lot of filtering here, and that is pretty much anything that doesn't need the bottom ends, like we're talking about, and like we talked about with the loops and the percussion. Anything that doesn't need that bottom, I'm filtering that out. I'm taking it out. So, for example, this hi-hat track. There is nothing in a hi-hat at 100 hertz that I need in my song to make it sound better, right? If you think about what a hi-hat is, all of that is high-frequency information. So whatever's happening at 100 hertz or whatever is just muddying up my sound. It's not leaving room for my low end, and we know that low end needs that room. So I'm filtering that pretty high. That's all the way up. That's at 2K. There's nothing below there that I need from those hi-hats, so it's gone. It's out of here. At the snare drum, I wanted to keep some bottom and weight in it, so I didn't filter it too high. I don't want it to feel thin and clappy. But still, nothing in that snare I need below 60 hertz, and that's where I want my kick drums to ring out. So that's got to go. The loop, same deal. All these vocal samples, same deal. We don't need it down there. Let the kick drums breathe. And then I'm doing the same thing in the vocals, and it's important for the vocals to leave space for other instruments, but it's also important for the vocals for the vocal compression, right? Henry doesn't need underneath 73.6 hertz for his vocal, but there might be some rumble in there. There might be some room sound. Maybe he bumped the mic stand, something like that. That's going to take care of all of that stuff because we don't want to hear that. But I don't want that rumble, that energy, those big low frequency waveforms, I don't want those making my compressors react to that energy that I can't even hear. I'm not hearing it, but the compressor doesn't care about that. It only knows how much level, how much energy is seeing it, and then it's going to stamp it down. It's going to clamp down on it. So let me get those big waveforms that I don't need down there. Let me get them out of the way. Then my compressors are going to react more accurately to what's going on with the vocal, and I'm going to have a cleaner vocal sound. That's a great way. That will also push your vocals forward because the compressor is not unnecessarily squeezing them because that low end is gone. So all of a sudden you got clarity when you do it. Can I do this? Is it? Yeah, let me jump back to Henry's verse and we'll look at that. How about that? See, that right there, to me, that is a night and day difference, right? Again, he was in there. Yeah, you can kind of hear him, but like, what is he saying? What's going on? I put that filter in and it's like, boom, he's talking right to me, right? And that's filtering out frequencies that you can't hear, but it just lets everything else sing out so much, right? You got to think about the fact that just because you can't hear it doesn't mean that there's not energy there, doesn't mean there's not sound there, and so you want to control that, and that's going to let that really sing out. Now, I want to talk about side chaining. Let's talk about side chaining real quick, and then I want to talk a bit about my mix bus and how that's working. When you say that you're side chaining in your kick and bass relationship, a lot of what happens with that is, what I see a lot of people do is they have a compressor on their bass track, for instance, for anyone who might not be up on that side chain. And every time the kick drum hits, you use the send. It sends a signal to the bass compressor, and it's going to compress the bass when the kick drum hits. And that is super cool. It's super useful. It's super useful for getting that bass to duck and drop out. The next move on that, you know what? I can set it up real quick on this 808. Let me do that. There we go. Let's get that chat rocking. I'm just going to keep it on the screen. Y'all need to see me. The mixer is more interesting. So let's set that up, Al. Let's talk about how we do that. I'm going to go ahead. Is this side chain? Okay, yeah. So this EQ will, this compressor will side chain. So the way you activate it is different for each software. So I'm not going to specifically talk about how you make this happen in Cubase. But what I did is I created a send on my kick drum track here, and now every time this kick drum hits, it's going to feed this compressor, and the compressor is going to duck that. And there we go. So the kick drum is going to trigger the 808, and it's going to trigger that compressor. It's going to duck that. But what I've been doing lately, because we talk about how the high frequencies of bass sounds are so important to the ear. So instead of having the whole bass duck when the kick drum hits, and so then it's going to be more obvious because the whole thing ducks, what if only the low end of the bass, the part where the kick needs to live, were to duck, and the rest of the bass stays where it is so the bass line sounds consistent, right? That's my new thing. So let me show you how I'm doing that. I'm doing that kind of thing with a multi-band compressor. So I got a nice multi-band here. This is a fab filter joint. You know, I'm showing you what I'm using. You can do this. You can do most of these things with any plugin. I got my favorites that I'm using, but I'm really not one of these people that's like, well, you have to have this exact thing or you can't mix and you can't work. I don't really believe in that, right? Ableton, for instance, comes with the tools to do all of this stuff. It's all right there built in for you, and it sounds good. We're at a point now with technology. Everything sounds good. It's just what you want to use. So don't look at any of this stuff and be like, well, I have to have this exact plugin that Green has to make it work. These are all just general things. This is just the tool that I go to, right? So that kick drum that we talked about, we want that hitting. We want that knock, that bottom to really thump every time. So let's make some space for it. So I've created a band here in the low end, and it starts at about 80. We'll see. We'll fine tune that when we get this going. So that's not at all what I meant to do. I'm going to add a side chain from my kick drum. We'll give it some nice level. And when I play the kick drum, now instead of ducking, I'm going to set this side chain so it takes the external side chain. Now, instead of ducking the entire sound when the kick drum hits, it's just going to duck the low end. It's going to let those higher frequencies stay in, so the 808 is going to feel like it stays exactly where it's supposed to be, but the bottom is going to be able to come through. Let's hear it. Right? So you can see on the screen, and you can kind of, hopefully you can hear it, where that top end, the boom, the kind of that part that we saturated to keep up there and stay put, that's staying put. But when the kick and the 808 here together, the whole mix doesn't bloom there. It just leaves enough space so everything can stay where you want it to be at. So that's that next step of that side chain, to really just leave the space for exactly what you want. But sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you might want that squishing sound from the bass. You know, I look at it, that's the J Dilla sound. You all know about J Dilla, that part where everything squashes, that pump, that's where there's a lot of energy. So maybe you want that. This is just a different way to do it if you want the higher frequencies of your bass. You want your bass to sound like it's staying right there. We're going to leave that on because I like how it sounds. So we're going to keep rocking without that. Let's keep moving. I'm not looking at my phone. I've got a list of notes, so I'm not checking the text, so please excuse me on that. Let's take a look at the hook. Now, if the vocal is the most important thing in a song, right? The chorus, the hook, is the most important part of the vocal, so that is the most important thing in your entire record, right? The hook is what everyone sings along to. The hook is what you remember. The hook is the part that really catches you. If this whole thing is an idea, then the hook is your main point, right? So we've got to make sure that that's working properly. Let's take a look at the hook. All right, so there's a lot happening here. Let's see what's going on. The beat, instrumentally, we bring in some more vocal samples, because why not? Also, I don't have a bass line in here, but this is strings. So this is like orchestral type beat. And there's that big reverb that I didn't want to put on the vocals. That's for the strings. It's hard to see what I did because I used outboard piece of hardware that we can't really get into today. But that's basically that's the sound. It's not super deep. It doesn't have a huge bottom that you might think from a big string bass type track. But again, that's on purpose because that's leaving the space for. That's leaving the space for the 808, which now you hear that distortion that we had on there and the way that we sidechained it, that 808 is staying right there the whole time. That thing is not moving, so that's what you want. But so the bass is not a huge lot of low end on it to leave space for that. We bring in this choir sample. That's real nice and pretty. All right, so that's going on. That's mostly straightforward. I use some outboard on that as well, but filtering down there. We get that. Let's look at the vocals, because the hook vocal is really the thing. When I do a hook, I stack it a few times. So these are all exact doubles. I had Liquid do the hook 4 times and do it exactly the same way. Stacking is not a new thing. I know we all understand doubling, but I want to talk about where and how I'm panning things and then how I'm addressing the hook as a whole. Let's solo the hook and let's take a listen to it. Okay, so there's some stuff going on there. It sounds distorted. It's like, Green, that's your hook. It's special. Why does it sound so grimy? Well, that's how I get down, but there's reasons for that. And it doesn't sound like that in the track necessarily. So what's going on with that? First things first, I've got basically the main, this hook number one, first one, that's my main hook track. And then I've got a double that is about 4 dB lower, and it is panned exactly the same space. When you want that sound of that double that's kind of rubbing against itself like that, you want it ideally to be panned right on top of itself, so it's gonna rub. When you pan out here, I'm gonna take these sides out for a second. If I pan this out even a little bit, it gives it a whole different. The most powerful thing that you have in your mixer, and everybody has this tool, your pan pot and your fader. Those are the most powerful things that you have. A little bit of pan one way or another can make all the difference. You know, plugins can do a lot of things, but when I had them right on top of each other, they blend, they glue in, and it feels much more like one vocal with a little bit of sauce on it. But the second I pan that out, even 2 degrees, 4 degrees, now all of a sudden this double is no longer being masked by the lead, and it's got its own space in the stereo spectrum, and that's going to poke out more. So that's really great if I've got a rap verse, and let's say there's only one dub track. So when I say dub, I don't know if that's a Brooklyn thing, that's what we say here, but that dub track is, where's Henry? Right here. So that's just, it's not a full doubling of the vocal like what's happening in the chorus, but that dub is like, those are the ins and outs, doublings of certain words. It's different than an ad-lib, where on an ad-lib you might be yelling some other stuff in the background and hyping up the track. It's not that hype track. This is emphasizing certain words, that in and out. That's the dub track. That's what I mean by that. So that's great for a verse, and you might have some of that on a hook, but for this hook I want size, so I need exact full copies. So that's what's going on here. But if on Henry's verse, he gave me 2 dub tracks, so they're panned out equally and pretty far out, so we can get a nice spread. If I only had one of those, if I took that and panned one of them to the left, then the whole mix sounds like this every time Henry says something in the dub track. So I'm going to keep it close to the center, but I want that to pop out a little bit and have its own space. So that's when I would do something like give it just a little bit of space off to the side. It's not going to feel like it's off to the left, but it's going to have its own space in the whole sonic landscape, and it's going to jump out for you. So that pan pot, just even that little bit, is so powerful when you're working. But in this case, I don't want to use that power. I want it to blend right in here with the vocal, with the hook lead. And then 3 and 4 here, again, these are full doubles, but now because I have it so locked down in the center, I can pan those hard all the way out. When you hard pan something, you got to remember, especially when people are listening in headphones, when you hard pan something, in headphones, it sounds like it's behind you instead of just on your sides, right? And that can feel like it's a little too much. Like on these dubs, on Henry's dubs, on Liquid's dubs, they're not panned out all the way out, right? There's a lot of space between center and hard left and hard right, and utilizing all that space in between, that's what gives you that really wide sounding mix, right? Because if not, it's just like, okay, things are here, there, and there, but you're not getting the full width to understand how wide is wide. So these are going out a little bit, but not all the way out. But on the hook, I want the hook to be wide. And I've got 2 vocals in the center that are anchoring that hook down there, so I can spread these sides out real nice and wide, and then we get the big hook that sounds. All right, so that's the side. They're far out, but with everything else in there, they stay linked right down there in the middle. So that's the start. So all of these are routed together. They're going to go to a hook track. Ooh, quick, before I do that, that double that I'm doing, you see here there's no EQ on my hook lead. But I'm notching out, a bunch, 10 dB at 500 hertz. Remember we talked about that's one of those muddy, that's really where it gets, when the people say something sounds boxy, that's where I find that boxiness is at 500 hertz, right? So I'm notching out there because it's a straight double of that vocal, and any frequencies that would build up with just one will definitely build up when you put two of them things together. So I'm notching that out. That was a problem frequency, and that lets, if this is my lead vocal, that lets that blend right in there behind it. And all of those are going to a bus where I'm EQing them together. Surprise, surprise, more around that 500, because now this is all for the vocals. So again, we got to get that out of here. We're rolling off under 60. Get it out of here. That's just only going to be mud. And from where this is going next, we can't add mud because a lot more is still getting added to this. And then right here at about 1.2K, Liquid's voice gets a little bit peaky there. And so instead of having that jab you in the ear every time, which nobody wants, I'm rolling that back, right? And then I've got, and this is a great little compressor, and this thing is like $40 or something, and I use it on every mix. Klanghelm, I really like their stuff. It's super flexible and it sounds really good. And this is to compress all of those vocals together. So I align them with something like Vocaline or whatever. What did I use on this? Can't see, but I've edited them so they're all lined up where I want them. And then with the compressor on it, squeezing them together, so instead of sounding like four vocals happening at the same time, I am approaching them as this is one sound and we're going to make this sound good. So let's see how much compression I'm doing on that. Right? Okay, so again, not a ton. I'm not taking off 10 dB. There's plenty of people who work that way and they squash things and it's a sound. It's just not my personal sound, but if that's your sound, this is not me telling you not to do it. This is me saying that that's just not how I do it, right? I want it to take off a little bit. I want to control it, but I want that energy and I want the dynamics in her voice. And I'm hitting it, but I'm even letting some of just the clean come through because there's more to come for this. So when we look at the sends, now, okay, all right, I'm sending it to some stuff. So I got a little bit of that slap delay that we were talking about. So that's going to give us the width. That's going to give us a little sparkle on the sides to give us some energy. It's the chorus, so the energy needs to be high. Everything needs to ride out. This is the hypest part of the song, right? And then I'm throwing it into a little bit of the reverb that the strings are going into because I want to give her this epic sound on this hook. I want it to sound, the whole thing is building here. I want it to be epic, right? But down here is where we can start getting into the real flavor of it. This is what gives it, obviously, this is a distorted vocal. And I'm sending it just like we talked about with the parallel compressor. And it's going to that parallel compressor. It's going to a lot of it. I'm not squashing it here on the direct signal, but I am hitting that parallel, pretty hard because I want this to sit right up front. It's the most important thing. But I had to do more on it because it's me and I wanted to do some more, and so we're setting it to a parallel distortion as well. And that's here. That's with the sound toys. See, we're back. I showed you the decapitator before, and with that punish button, and this is driven all the way. Like, this is me really like, wow, we're gonna smash this. And then just for good measure, because it wasn't squashed up enough, we're gonna hit it with this devil lock, which is a compressor, super aggressive, and you can see by the knobs, we got crush, we got crunch. Like, that thing is really gonna hit too. And let me see if I can play what that does by itself. So when I bring that up, you start to see it's a lot that I'm doing there. It's a lot of distortion, and that's why it's mixed so low in. this goes beyond, I want to give some texture for where she will sit, where she needs to be. This is, I want distortion. I want a heavy distortion, but I want a little bit of it. You know what I mean? I want all that grumble, but I want to hear it loud screaming in my face because I want to keep the clarity on her voice. So this is just adding, this is where we talk about this song has this kind of apocalypse feel, kind of this end of the world feel to it. That's why I wanted to have the hook be distorted, because I'm listening to the song. The song is telling me this thing needs to sound scary because it's the end of the world. So let's get this hook sounding scary so it feels like the end of the world. You feel me? Are we looking on time? Okay. We're starting to pull toward the end a little bit, so make sure if you got any more questions or if I'm not clear on something, make sure to hit it in the chat. I got the window open now. I can see what you're saying. I've got it figured out. And let me know. I'm going to jump over now toward my mix bus, which in some ways maybe I should have even started with, but we're going to look at it now here at the end because I always come back to it. I had a long conversation with my assistant yesterday when I was mixing a record. Yeah, Al, there is a compressor on that vocal on that vocal bus. Yes, along with having the parallel for the weight behind it. That's this DC8 compressor. So just enough of an attack to make sure I catch the beginnings of her words so they stay right there and stay focused. About a 1 second release. I don't want it to hold on forever. I want it to let her breathe, and then I'm rolling off the mix to like 80%, so a little bit of her direct sound comes through. Again, just for that clarity and leave those dynamics in, because I'm squashing parallel pretty heavy. So it is a combination of both, but I am using compressor right on the group. But speaking of compression, on the mix bus, I have a couple things. And the reason I say I should have started with it is, if you're going to use things on your mix bus, your stereo bus, your two mixers, a lot of things for it, but basically the end bus that everything comes down to, like if you're mixing in Pro Tools, you had to create this track, but that should be the first thing that you do. Everything should boil down to a mix bus, to a final bus where everything comes together on. In Cubase and Ableton, I think in Logic, that's built in Pro Tools, you do have to create this track. But that's where I'm doing processing that is going to hit the entire song as a whole. One of those things is, I'll make that smaller so we can get more stuff on here, is this audio thing. It's a Type A, it's a dynamics processor. I've also got one of my favorites. This is from Plugin Alliance. This is the Iron compressor. It's like a mastering compressor, but I use that on the bus. And then I like this tape saturation from Softtube or from wherever on the end. Just gives it some glue, and again, this is all the stuff that gives it the vibe, right? I'm gonna bypass my mix bus, and I'm gonna play, and then I'll bring it back in. Alright, so that's a huge difference, obviously. And that's why I say I should have started with this. It's super important to me. It's so important. I'm going to share the screen on this. We're gonna look right on the camera for this. If you're going to be using stuff on your mix bus, like specifically a compressor, and I've talked a lot about all the different crazy compression I'm doing in other spots throughout this song, but everything winds up hitting that mix bus before, and therefore the stereo compressor across the whole thing before it's done. I want to have that compressor on my mix bus at the beginning of the mix. I've seen a lot of people at the end of the mix, okay, the mix is almost done, now I'm going to put a compressor on the whole mix and dial it together. Well, the second you do that, you just messed up all of the compression that you've been working for hours on your individual tracks and on your other buses and everything, right? Because now you're adding something that changes how all of those dynamics work. But if you start your mix with that on there, and obviously you don't know how much you need, but get it into some pretty general settings to begin with, then you're working with that the whole way through. So any compression choices that you make on your vocal or on your snare drum or whatever, that mix bus compressor is accounted for, and so you're not having to redo everything at the end, right? And also, when you start throwing plugins on the whole thing at the end, if you've been mixing for 5 hours or however long your mix is, now all of a sudden you lost perspective on everything that you did up until this point because you just changed the sound of your whole thing, right? You're throwing out all the hard work that you did. So over time, and this is an experience thing, and over time, the more and more you mix, you get to know what you like to have across your entire song. Build yourself, make yourself a preset and start with that and have it on there and then adjust it over time. You're going to get better results and be less frustrated than trying to rebuild your mix at the end with something brand new. So that is a huge, very important part of that for me. So I'm starting with this Type A. Chat, there we go. It's based on an old noise reduction thing, but basically it's got attack and release, and there's 4 bands. It's kind of like a multi-band compressor. And I don't make too many adjustments to it, but it gives this nice polished feel to it. And it's the first spot. I have a fast attack on it, and that's the first spot where I'm really starting to compress my whole mix. I'm using that. Got a lot of drum stuff going on, and I'm using that to start catching transients and catching stray things. That's when I'm starting to glue things together on the mix bus. And then I go into, this is my primary compressor on it, and I've got a slower attack. On this one, I've got kind of a faster release because I want that motion and that clarity with it. And then over here, this is the sidechain filter. A lot of compressors are now using this. You're probably seeing a lot of stuff. And when I raise this up, that means that here, anything below 140 hertz is not going to make the compressor start to compress and start to squeeze down. So my bass, my 808s and all that, that is just ringing through clear, and it's not causing everything to suck down. So that's why I'm thinking about compressing that early on, and that lets there be more clarity in the rest of the mix, but my bass and my low end can still be loud and ring out because it's not causing everything else to squeeze in. So that's an important part of that. And then I just use the parallel mix. I just dial it in to taste. I really like dynamics. For me, for my sound, and especially for this record, I am not a make everything extremely compressed type of mix guy. That's just not how I rock. A lot of people do that. Most of the mainstream mixers are really doing that, especially in the mastering. Everything is just kind of like super hammered out. But for me, I want the dynamics to give you that emotion, to give you that movement. If you're not moving when you're listening to my records, I feel like I did something wrong. And then, like I said, I just hit that tape. And, you know, it is driving it, again, a little more distortion. And I wouldn't go as far as distortion. That's just a little bit of saturation, a little bit of glue on there that is going to kind of put the finishing touches. I have that on last because I'm kind of old school. When you did a mix, you would print it to tape. Instead of bouncing the disc, you printed to tape. And so my tape is on the end because that's where it goes to me. So that's what's going on with my mix bus. I don't do a lot of EQing on there. I'll use these bands. Al, great question. Yeah, I'm gonna get that. That is the next question. I use these bands to kind of sculpt the sound, but I don't want to. If I have to do a lot of work on the mix bus with an EQ to make something sound right, I need to go further upstream. I got to look at my tracks and say, okay, what's not hitting here? Everything probably doesn't need to be brighter. Maybe I need to open up the high end on that percussion a little bit to imply the brightness without making everything just tinny and bright. Just not that's not me. That's 6 dB. So if you're not looking at the chat, Al just asked super critical question. Can keeping minus 6 dB on the mix bus. When this song, this is a mixed, it was mastered, it would be going, if this was a brand new record that wasn't already out or whatever, this needs to go to mastering. I need to leave headroom for my mastering engineer to be able to compress, EQ, and whatever, and minus 6 dBs kind of become the standard on the kind of headroom that you want to leave for your mastering engineer. And I do mastering as well, so I try to stay pretty strict to that because that's what I want to see it. You'll see I'm on the master levels. This is my final plugin on the whole mix. I'm driving that tape. You see, I'm pushing it here. I'm at 1.8 on there. I'm driving that, but I am compensating and I'm bringing down the output gain to minus 4.4 in this case, and that is specifically to make sure that I'm leaving that headroom for that minus 6. I'm leaving that headroom for whoever's going to master it, whether it's me or somebody else, right? Maybe it'll be one of y'all. It's a good habit to be in. What you'll see is I don't have any kind of limiter or any kind of L2 or maximizer on the end of this. Occasionally, maybe I'll use a little bit, but this is not about making the mix as loud as possible before mastering. Mastering is about getting that final level up to where it needs to be. But if I put a limiter on this and I squash it so everything is loud and pumping, the more you compress something, the harder it is later on to be able to EQ or be able to process it further because everything is so scrunched up. And that's why I go so easy on compression throughout, so I have that flexibility. But if I put a limiter on this thing at the end, whoever's mastering it, Al, maybe you're going to master it for me, you're not going to be able to work with everything because everything is just squished together and is not going to be able to work with. So adding the stuff for artistic purposes, yeah, especially the tape, this is for a tone type of thing. The iron, that compressor is to glue everything together, but I'm not using these to get me down to minus 6. I'm using them to exactly what you're saying for artistic, creative purposes to make it sound right. And then at the end, I'm going to make sure to remember to keep my levels right for it to go to mastering, ideally around minus 6. So yeah, whatever it is, I'll use the last output knob, or I might use another, just like gain plugin just to bring it down or whatever. But I don't want to send my mastering engineer something that's limited and peaked out at minus 0.1 dB because they can't do anything with it. So Al, yeah, you're exactly right. And that's really important. You got to give your mastering engineer some room to move. And over compressing isn't going to solve it. And sure, they can turn it down later on, even if it's not compressed, if it's just loud. But, professional courtesy. And also, if on average things are hitting at minus 6, then there's space. Okay, well, my hook can be a little bit louder because you want your hook to grow in size and be exciting. So maybe the hook now is peaking at maybe minus 5, maybe minus 4. That's okay because I left that headroom there, so nothing is clipping out. There's no danger of a spare snare hit or something clipping out. There's plenty of room there. That's just that safety net because there's still time to turn it up. All of that is critical. But when I send this to my client, when I send this to the artist to listen to and to approve the mix before we go to mastering, if this thing is at minus 6, it's going to feel very quiet for your artist. And the first thing they're going to ask you is, yeah, Green, this sounds great, but can you turn it up? It's really quiet. It doesn't sound like everything else in my iTunes or whatever. And that's kind of the challenge that we do, so that we have. So I will print this mix at minus 6, knowing that it's going to mastering. And then I will print one using a very neutral limiter to just bump it up maybe 5 dB or whatever. So when the client listens to it, it's at a volume for them that they feel sounds good, and so they're not worried that their mix doesn't bang, right? You want to take care. You can explain to them and tell them, well, just turn your stereo up or whatever. Your artist probably doesn't want to hear about all that. They just want to know why their mix doesn't bang. And the more you have to make excuses for why it doesn't bang, the less they're going to trust you, right? And the trust between you as an engineer and as your artist is everything. So I print a version for the mastering, and then I print a reference version with the limiter on it, bumping that up so it sounds right to them when they hear it. So we got about 10 minutes left here. Make sure anybody else, if you got more questions, now is your time. And I'm going to talk about real quick about some of the sauce that I put on, some of the special effects that I put on the mix just to give it that extra last bit of life and let it and create some special moments. Dealing with loop-based music like I do, like maybe some of you do, like a lot of people do, when you're programming, we're talking about 2, maybe 4, maybe 8 bar loops that repeat for however long. And when you got the right loop, the right beat, that's cool, and it rides and it's comfy and that's cool, but it repeats and it becomes repetitive. So what do we do to make special moments in the song special? Well, that is my favorite part of mixing. That's where I get to use some special effects that might be on the whole mix, might be on big parts of the mix, all the drums. Let me jump back, Al, because I'll do that before I talk about the sauce. Safest level when recording vocals or drums. For a long time, as audio equipment was getting better over time, a lot of people would say you have to record as loud as possible, as close to 0 dB full scale as you possibly can. It is not those days anymore, and modern converters sound good enough, even, like from top to bottom, whatever scale, it doesn't matter what budget. They sound a lot better than what people were working with in the early 2000s when they started to think about this. I like to get a good, healthy level. I'm usually around maybe somewhere between minus 8 dB and maybe minus 12 on average with a vocal. If my vocal track is clean, then it's going to be easy for me to raise that level up later on. If my environment is noisy, well, then there's a whole other set of problems, right? But ideally, if we're getting a clean vocal, that way it leaves the artist space to, again, be dynamic. So maybe there's a part, all right, beginning of the verse, they rhyme it, and they're like here, and this is this moment, but maybe the end of the verse gets bigger, gets louder, and they get more hype, and we're leading up to the hook, and everybody's hyping, it's great. But if I was recording everything at minus 4 up till then, the MC's gonna peak out before we get to the hook. Yeah, minus 6 is a good level for that XJ. Minus 6, minus 8, somewhere around there, just where you know that you're getting the good resolution and you're using the headroom that's in your converters and in your interface, but you're leaving yourself that safety net the same way we leave it at the end of the mix. In case something peaks out, you got space for that. But you want a healthy level. You want to use the resolution of your converters. If you're down like under 20 dB, and it's just kind of moving the needle, go ahead and turn that thing up. A good, full, healthy sound may lead to a good, full, healthy mix. But you don't have to go super crazy. Technology is good now. Even like the real entry-level stuff sounds really, really good compared to what folks were dealing with a while back. So safe but healthy levels. Safe but healthy everything sounds good to me. You know what I mean? So real quick, let's look at... I'm going to play going out of the hook and then Def C's verse, and you're going to hear where the sauce is at here. Alright, so there's a lot of stuff going on in there with the drums. There's a lot of stuff happening. Went to this real lo-fi thing. This song is older. This song was from 2016, I think this project came out. There's 3 verses on it. That's long for modern rap songs. A lot of modern rap songs are just 2 verse, in and out type of things. This is 3MCs. Everybody's got to get some. But this song is 4.5 minutes long, almost 5 minutes long. That's a lot of song, and it's a lot for what is essentially a 4-bar drum loop to just rock the whole time. So I am adding in special moments as usually like coming out of a hook, going into a verse. It's like, let's spotlight who's coming in next. Or it's going into a hook, and it's like, here comes the special part. We got to usher everything in here. So what am I doing with these drums here? So I'm sending to effects before it goes to my drum bus, which I have over here. So if I adjust the level of this drum bus, if I bring that down, anything that is sending before that, on the tracks before that, that is just going to keep on sending, excuse me, and you're just going to hear that wet sound, just the wet sound as I bring down the direct sound. So that's going to the drum compressor, which is similar to the vocal compressor. It's a parallel thing, and I'm really squashing it. Ratio 10:1, I'm really hitting that. And then we got some delay stuff going on. Let's take another look at that.
My leg in this lost oasis.
Like a two-headed snake chasing its tail. Huck was easiest to kill after braising a quail. With a big fish dying in a dry pond, knocking me to the side like a pylon. What you get for the man who has...
My bad, I forgot to mute. That's my fault. Y'all reminded me and I messed it up. But, actually that probably sounded terrible. Let me try it one more. So this right here, this skitter delay is really what is the special effect that's going on here. And I'm sending to that. I think my snare must have it. Yes, that's automated. When we get to that part, my snare drum has it, my loops have it, and what it is it's a very short delay. It's a 30-second note delay. And it's kind of lo-fied out. I don't want it too bright. And there's some feedback, so this thing is kind of ringing, and then I've got an auto panner underneath that because it's not quite a ping pong, which I can do over here. It is going from left to right and then jumping back, right? It's not left, right, left, right. It's moving left, right, left. You see what I mean? So it's a different type of thing. So I didn't just do the ping pong, but that is this choppy delay that sometimes you're getting on vocals, here you're getting on the drums, and it gives this grainy, swooping kind of drum cloud right there that opens right up and really just presents Def C. It's like, okay, here comes this third verse, let's get it. This must be special because the whole beat broke down and now everything is swirling around me and it's feeling crazy. So, you know, it's important. Yeah, it's showing off a little bit. I like to flex a little bit with some fancy effects and whatever, and that part can be a lot of fun, and it's the ear candy for the listener, and that makes it exciting, but it does serve the song. It's not just, oh, let me do something fly to show off for somebody so they think I can mix. This is an important event in the song, and so we need some flavor here to accentuate that. And so I'll wrap up and I'll leave you with this, is that everything that I'm doing is serving the most important thing, that's the song, right? Listeners don't listen to vocal parallel compression. We do. We're keyed in on that. They just want to know if the song is good. So everything that I'm doing here has to serve to make the song good, and if not, what's the point, right? So that's what I've got. I really appreciate y'all rocking with me. If you got any more questions, let's go ahead and we'll do that now. But this is about my time, and this has been great. I hope y'all are enjoying this. I really appreciate the feedback and the comments and the chat. You know, it helps me know what you want to know and get to know y'all some more. So let me know if there's anything else. But apart from that, you know, I'm Willie Green, coming to y'all live from Brooklyn, New York.